Good evening, everyone, and welcome. So my name is Anna Yang. It's great to see so many of you here for such an exciting event. So I'm a senior fellow here at the Hoffman Center for Sustainable Resource Economy at Chatham House. And along with the Club of Rome, we're very happy to host the UK's launch of Come On, Capitalism, Short-Termism, Population, and the Destruction of the Planet. Before I hand over to the authors, just a small bit of housekeeping. So you will see that there are two exits, this one from where you came in and that one. And if the fire alarm goes on, it's an actual fire, so it's not drill. So we don't have any drills planned tonight. So in terms of the agenda today, the co-authors, Anders Wijkman and Ernst von Weizsäcker, will present the book. Then we'll have a panel discussion with Catherine Trebeck, who is the research director at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and Tim Jackson, who is a professor of sustainable development and director of the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity at the University of Surrey. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here. So many of you will be frequent visitors of Chatham House, so you'll be used to the Chatham House rules. And actually, I'm very pleased to say that today we won't be holding any of the Chatham House rules. This is going to be on record, and the event is being live streamed. We had signed up participants from a lot of developing countries, and they're interested in joining the debate as well. So we're going to have a more interactive conversation with Q&As and panels, and then also questions coming in from all over the place. Just in terms of the discussion and the live polling, the instruction is that please participate the discussion through the slido.com. I think there are instructions there. And enter the number 6318. And also, you can use the hashtag #ComeOn on social media, and you will have a chance to win a free signed book. And with that, I will leave you to the authors to take it away with us. Please.
Thank you. I'm Ernst. Anders and I were elected co-presidents of the Club of Rome in 2012. And we immediately realized that the Club of Rome had grown a little old. And that this was 40 years after the publication of The Limits to Growth. And we felt repeating that message year after year, 40 years, is not good enough for a good living club. So we did a lot of rejuvenation, new people as members of the Club of Rome. Tim, you were not a Club of Rome member when we began? You are a new member.
I am.
Okay, yeah, so it's also rejuvenating.
Yeah.
Anyway,
wow.
And we felt we need new themes. And out of that conviction grew the idea for a new major report to be written for the 50th anniversary of the Club of Rome, which is in 2018. And it's now here, and Anders is going to introduce it.
Well, we take our starting point, of course, in the Limits to Growth from 1972, which basically said, had one major message. The way the economy is organized, we are going to run into problems in terms of pollution and/or resource constraints, not tomorrow, not even the day after tomorrow, but 50 to 100 years from now. And we didn't say that growth in itself was the problem. The problem was the growing footprint on mankind. And of course, that message resonated quite well. It was criticized by many, not least by economists, but it resonated with very many people. And it's been with us as a theme ever since. And this new book, we take a look at where are we today if we compare with where we were in 1972. And we deal, of course, with the relationship between man and nature. and we realized that ecosystems are on rapid decline all over the place. Biodiversity loss is a much worse problem than it was at the time. We take, of course, look at climate change and developments. Since 1992, when we had the climate convention agreed upon in Rio de Janeiro, emissions have gone up by more than 40%. And I would submit, I've dealt a lot with that issue over the last 5 to 10 years, I would submit that we have not really started the transition to a low carbon economy, honestly. We have done some tinkering on the margin. My country, Sweden, is very often singled out as sort of a hero, a leader on climate change. Well, we have cut emissions by 20–22% territorially since 1992 or 1990. But if we include our air travel abroad, and if we include all the imports of goods, our footprint has, in fact, increased. So this just shows how difficult this is, and what the bind we are in. We refer to the Paris Agreement, and I very often quote Georges Monbiot, because he said the day afterwards, in comparison with what it could have been, it's a miracle. In comparison to what it should have been, it's a disaster. And of course, that's because there is nothing said about the implementation. And we have all our focus on energy and energy systems. And there some positive things have happened. Wind, solar energy, costs going down, etc. But we have not done anything yet about materials. Materials is the other side of the coin. Cement, steel, plastics, aluminium make up roughly 20% of carbon emissions in the world. And Ernst and I, we are members of the International Resource Panel. We have done some estimates. Urban infrastructure is going to double in the next 25 years. And you can imagine if it happens with today's technologies and today's materials, only that, the materials will consume the carbon budget for 2 degrees. So this just shows that we are only in the very beginning of the transformation that is needed. We look at resource constraints, and that's another field, of course, phosphorus, rare earth metals, soils, not to speak about that. But we look also at a lot of social issues. We try to understand the financial system and the weaknesses and shortcomings, and we make the point that we cannot really understand 30 years afterwards how the global leaders in the 1980s could liberalize and deregulate the financial system the way they did without putting any real rules of the game or provisions or policy frameworks in place. It is really a system that has grown into somewhat of a cancer in our economies. It may be understood that one wanted to expand lending and liquidity in the interest of growing the economies. But the way it was done is something we really criticize a lot. And we also have some suggestions on what to do about it. We devote one chapter to population. We were a little bit more than 3 billion people when the Limits to Growth report was written. We are now 7.5 or 6, close to 8 billion. The latest UN population estimate is that before the end of the century, we may level out around 11 billion. Some people say that population is not so important with regard to ecology and climate because the footprint of poor people is very limited. Our response is, whenever a baby is born, we have the responsibility to try to provide a decent standard of living. And that means energy, that means water, that means land, that means shelter, etc. So however we look at it, population is a challenge. And we know that there are hundreds of millions of families, in particular women, in the developing world who would like to have assistance to reduce fertility, to reduce the number of newborns, but they cannot get it. So this is an issue that we have to put on the table again. After Cairo in 1994, there has been very little discussion. We also discussed technologies, disruptive technologies. In some areas, not least with regard to climate change, they are very much needed. Technology disruption to move towards a low-carbon society. But we also make the point that disruption, if it's too abrupt, can cause many, many problems. So that we need a balance. We need a balance there. Finally, we come to the conclusion that the world we live in today is very much different from 40, 50, or 60 years ago. And we quote Herman Daly, who distinguishes between the empty world and the full world. And we are now living in the full world. And we make the point that the economic model that we are entertaining was developing in the empty world, when we were between 1 and 2 billion people. You can maybe say that the neoliberal revolution in the early 1980s accentuated the model. But basically, we are living by the same sort of concepts as we did when the population was very, very small, and when planet Earth looked abundantly rich. And you could do things that you cannot do in the full world. Over to you.
Okay. Well, let me continue on that one. Herman Daly and Bob Costanza and others use the question of fish for explaining the distinction between empty world and full world. In the empty world, if you want more fish, what do you have to do? More fishermen or women, and more nets, and more boats, and then you have more fish. As simple as that. In the full world, what you have to do in the first place is defining fishery restriction areas all over the place. Otherwise, you will have less fish. So it's almost the opposite in terms of economics. But, you know, economics was formulated essentially in the 18th century by Adam Smith and others, and at the time was quite good. And then in our second part of the book, or second chapter, we go into the philosophical crisis that we are in. And one way of explaining that we are in a crisis is referring to the climate agreement of Paris. Countries were there and made commitments, what they have to do, which was wonderful. And then the message comes back to the capitals. And there, the typical reaction is, well, yes, we have to do something better on climate, but it's going to be very, very expensive. So we need a lot more growth. That's the automatic reaction in all countries of the world, north and south. But then we happen to know that what we call growth, I mean GDP, is strongly correlated with carbon dioxide emissions. You know? So we are pretty good doctors in terms of defining the disease, and extremely bad doctors in terms of remediation. And that seems to be one example of a philosophical crisis. And in a similar way, we can go through the heroes of our modern world living in the empty world, like Adam Smith. And then we found out he is consistently badly quoted. For him, it was absolutely undisputable that the geographical reach of the market, the invisible hand, and the geographical reach of the law were identical. Meaning, the market is in the frame of the law, and then it's fine. But today, markets are global and the law is national. So markets are blackmailing countries to do things to improve returns on investment, even if that destroys environment, destroys social equity, and all the other things. But then they quote Adam Smith saying, he has said, selfishness is good for all, you know? And then there is David Ricardo. And we, here in London, we allow ourselves to use British or Scottish heroes. David Ricardo, who proved, in a sense, that international trade is good for both. But then he also said, I learned that from Herman Daly, that capital was not moving. Capital stayed where it was. But today, what is moving? It's essentially capital. We have a Belgian member of the Club of Rome, Bernard Littard. He was a banker. And he says, of £100 that are traveling around the world at the speed of light, £2 are used to pay for goods and services. And £98 are pure speculation. And they are moving so extremely fast. And then in textbooks of economics, they say mobility is good, capital is good, returns on investment are good, etc., quoting David Ricardo. You know, it's crazy. And then I used to be a professor of biology for a while. And I happen to know Charles Darwin reasonably well. Again, British. And he is quoted as if competition by all against all worldwide is the best for evolution. That's the opposite of what he said. I mean, he came to the Galapagos Islands where he found finches which had developed fantastic abilities, like one cracking a cactus thorn to extend the beak. So they could carve insects out of the bark of a tree or so. And this was only possible, according to Darwin, in the absence of woodpeckers. I mean, in the South American continent, they had lots of woodpeckers. But the absence of woodpeckers was the condition for finches to learn this cactus thing. So, insulation, geographical insulation, as one condition for evolution. Isn't that again the opposite of how he is quoted today? You know, these are three examples. You could name probably a dozen or more who are badly, wrongly quoted to make the point of a wrong economy. As if between empty world and full world, there was no distinction. So it's a philosophical crisis. And then we say a little improvement on economics is also good, but not good enough. We need a new Enlightenment. You know, also the European Enlightenment of the 18th century and before was in the empty world. And there it was really very good. It was liberation. We don't say anything negative about the early Enlightenment, but we say in the full world we need a different thing. And one of the characteristics of it should be balance. If you put a question about a conflict to somebody, the automatic reaction of the listener is, yes, one is right and the other is wrong, and the search for truth consists in proving that the one who is right and the other is wrong. Okay. If you show the same conflict to a person from Asia, from Japan, China, India or so, the automatic reaction there is, well, of course, both are right. The task is to find a good balance. And now we have certain questions in which one is right and the other is wrong. Like 2 times 2 is 4, not 5. Okay. But if we come to a question like short-term or long-term economy, I mean, if we are thirsty, we rather have some water now, not 30 years from now. But if we're talking about climate, this is a long-term affair. We need a balance between the two. Or in the political left side, you typically talk about justice, which is good. And the right side, we need incentives for achievement, which is also good. But this can't mean justice is right and incentives are wrong, or the other way around. No, we need both. So for the politically relevant conflicts or questions, we need balance. So we hope that the center part of the book on a new Enlightenment will be part of the discussion about the book, but then comes part 3, where we go back to pragmatic things, what we can do in terms of energy, agriculture, etc. And now it's your turn again.
Well, and what I should have said at the outset was, of course, that we are, in the first part of the book, very concerned about many social issues, not only the financial system. And in particular, that inequalities seems to be on the rise. Piketty had a book a couple of years ago, and we do receive new statistics all the time. And growing inequalities is bad for at least 2 reasons. One, it's unfair. And the second is that it affects social capital, the glue in society. And when inequalities grow, the social distance also grows. And people in society get less concerned about the common good. They get more concerned about themselves. And we are very, very concerned about this, we could say, degradation of social capital, which of course also is one of the reasons why we see a lot of populistic or authoritarian, or the combination of both, in politics. We need not talk about Trump. I was in Hungary the other day. I was in Poland yesterday. We have Erdogan. We have many examples of policies that had not been possible if we hadn't had this tendency that globalization as a system has produced or created this notion of the winning elite and the losers, or the excluded, or those left behind. So this is one of the issues that we have to deal with, of course, first now, and we cannot wait for a shift of mindsets that the new Enlightenment will be the purpose of. Another thing is, of course, to take climate change seriously. We write in the book, we need a crash plan. And we have to distinguish between incrementalism and transformation. What we have done so far in Europe is incremental change. You can take away, you can reduce emissions by 20–25% within the present system by being a bit more efficient. But if you are moving close to 0 in terms of emissions, you need transformation. And we have hardly started. And we make the point that this is now must be the top priority for governments. And it's energy and energy systems, and we give a lot of evidence that here things are moving. Energy efficiency, factor 5, etc. Renewable energy technologies. But the other side of the coin, materials, that is an issue which we have hardly started. We talk a lot about the circular economy, but we still have very linear flows. So that's one of the issues we are devoting a lot of time to. And the reasons are, on the one hand, that carbon emissions can be lowered significantly if we move from linear flows to circular flows, material flows. But also that we can capture and save a lot of money. We lose a lot of money. We have done a study in Sweden where we have shown that after first cycle use, 2 minutes. After first cycle use for most materials, there is very little value left, simply because design was poor. And you don't solve that by increasing recycling rates, because what you recycle and collect is of very limited value. A third area is, of course, agriculture. I don't have time to go into detail, but one thing is clear. Every time we put a plow into the soil, we release a lot of carbon. And we have now more and more evidence from the US, from Australia, from West Africa, and also from some farmers in Europe, that no-tilling, rotation of crops, perennial crops, and always cover the ground by some kind of a plant increases fertility, builds carbon in the soil, reduces the need for inputs, fertilizers and pesticides, and increases the yields. This must be part of the carbon agriculture policy, of course. So we can use land not only in the forest context, but also in agriculture to absorb and build up carbon. Last but not the least, the financial system, the financial sector. I indicated that we believe it's one of the major problems to move towards a more sustainable society. And by the way, it's also one of the reasons why we have this enormous spread of income and wealth in the world. I need not bore you with statistics. Now, what do we do about it? Well, one of the most easy things to do and logical things to do would be to increase the ratio of equity or capital that you need for banking and for financing. I saw in the paper today in New York Times that the US Senate is US Congress is now contemplating to lower that ratio from 5% to 4%, meaning that the leverage will be much stronger. We think we should at least increase it to 20 or 25%. That would reduce risk-taking significantly, because people would take risks not with others' money, but with their own money. So that's one of the aspects. The other aspect is, of course, that we have to account for stranded assets and the risk of climate change. There are financial institutions who have started doing that. Mark Carney gave a very interesting speech the other day and challenged the whole financial community to really take climate change and fossil fuel dependence seriously. But we are far away from that. So these are just a few examples of things we can do today to start moving in the right direction. Ultimately, we believe we need a new economic model. We need new thinking to solve problems. We cannot, like Einstein, we cannot solve the problems we have created by exactly the same thinking. But it will take time, it will require education, the increase of consciousness level, etc. So a combination of a short track, where some of the recipes that we line up in chapter 3, and then efforts in the longer term for this mind shift that is so necessary. That's the main message of the book. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our impatience comes from the fact that we both were members of parliament.
Yeah.
Yes.
Some time ago.
Well, thank you, Anders and Ernst. Before I open for the panel discussion, I'm going to launch the first poll to the audience. So, do we have the question online? Yeah. So the question is, what is the greatest threat that we're facing today? So you will see that you can vote in a couple of the. Oh, I already see some of the results, but I'll tell you later. And then, so please don't forget to vote at the slido.com, number 630. It's changing very fast now. Very interesting. So I'm going to start with Catherine. So Catherine, what was it on the book that resonated the most with you, and what are some of the challenges or the issues that you might slightly disagree?
So there's plenty that really resonates, and I think I found the dual meaning of the phrase "come on" very, very attractive. For those of you who yet haven't bought it and read it, the two meanings are around sort of "come on, stop fooling us with these outdated orthodoxies and this old-fashioned thinking that doesn't bear any relevance to the challenges currently stating the world." So it's a bit of a, come on, wake up. We're being duped. And I'm sort of obviously reminded by sort of Gramsci's concerns around the hegemony of the common sense and how we need to sort of break out of that. And that speaks to that new thinking that we so desperately need. And then the other notion of come on is quick. We've really got to mobilize change at all different levels to bring about this sort of balance. I love this idea of a balance agenda that our world so desperately needs. The book draws on many of my intellectual heroes. So it's really an enjoyable read. The language is very, very thoughtful and I think very considered. I can imagine it was something you thought about a lot, getting the language right and the tone. As someone who's done quite a bit of work on alternative measures of progress, I'm really very sympathetic with the deconstruction of GDP, the critique of some of the inconsistencies in the SDGs. As also someone who used to work in the Adam Smith building at the University of Glasgow, I'm very happy to see the great man being put back in context and no longer being misappropriated. So I really appreciated that. And this, as I said already, the idea of this balance agenda that is about justice and fairness and moderation and perhaps most importantly, distribution, I found very, very compelling. But I want to hold on to that word distribution and sort of come to some of the questions that are left lingering in my mind, and particularly its idea of this full world and the notion of population as an area that we want to focus our change on. Because I think the reality, yes, there are a lot of people on the planet, and you can't deny when you look at the equation of the impact on the planet is number of people times affluence, and the deep reality is that some people are a lot fuller than others, and don't worry, they do talk about that, but not in the same section. And I feel much more comfortable when we're talking about population if we are talking about, and to use the phrase of the authors, the overconsumption of the rich. And they talk about how really that so many people are consuming too much. And I think the sooner we perhaps nudge the term Anthropocene out and start talking about maybe the Plutocene, that it is some few people who are consuming way too much, and they are eating up that ecological room for those people who, as Anders rightly said, have every right to increase their material standard of living. And so I think to have those conversations at the same time, in the same chapter, is really, really vital. And I think, because otherwise the risk is that if we talk about population on its own, we give the current economic model a get out of jail card, because theoretically we could reduce the population and perhaps we might start to solve some of the environmental problems, but we would still have an economic system that leads to alienation and precarity and massive economic and inequalities of wealth. And so that's why I really, I think, to me, the questions are, how we, integrate those sorts of questions. The idea of disruption, and I think it's teased out really nicely in the book, and there's some sort of really words of caution around. We've got to think about how disruption can impact people's lives and ensure that disruption is something that's positive, that it doesn't terrify people. And so folks whose livelihoods depend on brown industries, who quite naturally you would be then holding on for dear life to that industry. It's up to us and up to politics and up to businesses to offer very tangible, very solid pathways out, because otherwise people are not going to take those steps into a brave new world of a sort of circular economy, and where we're green economies and so on. We really need to ensure that people have good, solid reason where their livelihoods will be protected to move away from the current way of doing things. And I think, to come on to another point around, there's a question there around and I'm not sure of exactly how you phrased, but the idea is that it's the innate human desires that have trapped us in the current system, I think in some of the early stages. And that got me thinking, is it really innate human desires, or is it desires that we've been told by advertisers, by the way the economy is set up, that we should have? And I've been really lucky to be involved in some projects over many, many years that speak to people around the world about what really matters to them. And what is quite extraordinary, whether it's in some of the poorest parts of Glasgow or in the slums of Delhi or in rural towns in Namibia, when you sit down and ask people, what is it that really matters to you? They tell you exactly the same things. And it's about quality of time with family, it's about relationships, it's about good local environment, it's about knowing that you and those you care about are safe and secure, and it's about sufficiency of income. Not having crazy sort of footballer type salaries, but having enough to get by and to participate. Wherever you are, if you sit down and ask people and give them a chance to reflect, then that's what they say is important. And so to me, that's what sort of the innate human desires are. And so I think there's a real question around how we have separated out what people know in their hearts really matters, to then what the current setup and arrangement of the economy and our daily working lives and what we're told constitutes economic success, what that pushes us into. And I'm reminded of this wonderful quote from Frances Moore Lappy. She says, why is it that we are collectively creating a world that none of us as individuals actually want? And I think, and then to quote one of my other intellectual heroes, Manfred Max Neef, he says, actually, we've all got those fundamental human needs. What we do is we grasp for these pseudo-satisfiers. And so we use consumption as a sort of false and unhelpful way to try and satisfy something that is really a very natural human need, one for affiliation and belonging. So I guess the question is, how do we unpick that edifice and have that economy that will enable us to align achieving our human needs in a sustainable way? Just very, very much quickly to finish up, the idea of governance and politics and incentives, and how do we create an operating system for businesses or for community groups or for individuals, that policy architecture, that policy ecosystem that particularly businesses operate in. And how do we have this sort of inspired governance where policymakers, and there are some who are trying to align policies with what people and planet really need. And so it's the thinking is a key part of that, but then the doing and helping those courageous policymakers. And I'm involved in this lovely little project to try and bring together policymakers who are starting to recognise that success of a country is not just about faster GDP growth. It's about creating a well-being economy or a balanced economy or a regenerative economy, or whatever how you want to refer to it. And our job, I think, is to really create the terrain in which those maybe more enlightened policymakers can step into. And I think there's a lot in this book that can build up our muscles for making that happen. So it's an extraordinarily important and timely contribution to that effort that I would like to assume all of us here tonight are part of.
One of the people working on regenerative economy is here. Herbie Girardet, also a member of the Club of Rome, of course.
Well, we can. We'll hear from Tim, and then we'll open up for a broader conversation. And what about you, Tim? What resonated with you, and what are some of the challenges or shortcomings?
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. As Catherine was talking, I was thinking about this "Come On" title has so many ways that you could say it. I quite like the idea that, you're at a kid's party and you've brought the birthday cake, and you suddenly realize that 2 or 3 kids have found where the birthday cake is, and the rest of the kids are still stuck in the back room somewhere, and they've got in there, and you get in there and you see actually the cake there's just 2 slices left, and you say, oh, come on! Is that really what you think is fair in this world of cakes and parties? And it reminded me a little bit of it is, in a sense, it's what we're doing, isn't it? There's a big cake there, it's called the planet. It's got lots of lovely fossil fuels and a very fragile climate, and a few people have got into the party early. and they've sort of said, yeah, I'll have a piece of that, and there's not much left of it. And then there's a sort of response to that, which you can sort of imagine from the kids, and they go, hang on a minute, what did we do wrong? We found ourselves in this room and there was this chocolate cake there. I mean, come on. what could we do but eat it? And it sort of also, it does speak to this sort of balance in a way between a very potentially the kind of idealistic notion that we can reinvent ourselves as moral beings on the one hand, and the role of justice in that, and on the other, this sense of actually being innately acquisitive, as William James once said, and Catherine was mentioning that aspect of it as well. There's this question of whether we are so fundamentally flawed as a species that actually, we're never going to win any of these battles. And all these lefties talking about justice and stuff like that, it's nonsense. They're just feathering their own nest so that they can write academic books and get more money and get a slice of the action, just like everybody else is. And between those two kind of views of humanity, I think it is right, and I like it that we do this. We have this sense coming through the book of a balance, of a new enlightenment. And my questions really, maybe that we can tease out a little bit in discussion, is to know a little bit more about that. What's the nature of that enlightenment? What's the ask? Where did the last enlightenment go wrong? If it did go wrong, did it go wrong, or was it just as Anders was saying, it was an enlightenment for an empty world, and now we're in a full world, so we need a different one? And what are the characteristics of that? And I remember actually after Prosperity Without Growth, Limits to Growth was first published. I was quite young at the time, 15 at the time, but it was so formative for me in its sense of sort of saying there is a finitude to the planet, there's a delicacy to the planet, there's a fragility to the planet, and actually we're riding roughshod over that with our industrial architecture, our production systems, our waste into the environment, and it's going to have a profound effect unless we change our ways. And it was very, very informative to me. It was a very formative part of my intellectual journey, and so one of my questions for you around that is what exactly are you now saying about the limits to growth? I mean, in some senses you're saying, yes, there are very, very strong limits, but in another sense, it's not such a powerful single message as the message that came out of Limits to Growth in 1972, which actually said the fundamental economic system that's driving what we think of as civilization coming out of the Enlightenment actually is fundamentally flawed, and we need something very, very different from that. We need something structurally different from that. And we have to say very firmly that if you follow these production processes in this economic system, growing in this way, then you're not ever really going to get out of the bind. And it was a very strong statement, and it elicited absolutely visceral responses. And it's really interesting to look at those visceral responses. You look at someone like Ronald Reagan, who, it went to the presidential level. And I'm sure that you would come on to go to Donald Trump's level. I mean, actually, it's his kind of language in a way, so it should do, shouldn't it? I mean, it is that sort of business, let's go for it, let's fix it, we can do this, nobody fails in my department, Trump Tower is an icon of respectability, and we're going to come on, we're going to fix America, we're going to make America great again, we're going to make the planet great again. It has that sort of, language and rhetoric to it. But actually, what Ronald Reagan said, and when he got his hands on this idea, oh God, there's these 4 guys, 3 men and a woman who've come out with this report which is saying we can't grow when GDP is our main indicator. What on earth are we going to do that? And actually some scriptwriter somewhere must have said, this is getting out of control. Come on, someone's got to come up with a speech that says why these idiots have got it all so wrong. And so they came up with this speechwriter, and he was probably someone who'd written for Ronald when he was a B actor in the movies, and he said there are no limits to economic growth because there are no limits to human ingenuity. you know, suck it up, that one. What are you saying about human beings if you think there's limits to growth? And when I give this to my students, because it's such a good thing to give to them to deconstruct, there are no limits to economic growth because there are no limits to human ingenuity. Now, which bit of that actually is the bit that's complete nonsense? And it's very interesting because there's no single bit that's complete nonsense. But when you put them together, it's utter garbage. And actually getting people to think through why it's garbage and to accept actually there's human ingenuity, but sometimes we're driven by innate instincts. And when you put kids in a sweet shop, they want to eat sweets. And when they get ill from that and sick up from that, they're not very well. And understanding that the kind of economy that we've created is one that excludes the poor, overindulges the rich, and trashes the planet, that doesn't come out of a simple single logic, but it comes out of a very powerful message about the limits of an economy on a finite planet. So I'm interested both in your position on that 50 years later, on that, you know, that fundamental challenge. Actually, you're measuring the wrong thing in the wrong way, and it's trashing the system. And also in the nature of this enlightenment that you're talking about. Where are our tools for understanding this new philosophy, this new enlightenment? What are the aspects of it that we could draw in? I was fascinated because I studied quantum physics one time many moons ago, that you drew on Fritjof Capra and you know, the complementarity of quantum physics. And I was also listening this morning to Melvin Bragg on I can't remember what the program's called, Our Times, I think it's called, and he was interviewing these 3 physicists about the proton. Now, this has got nothing to do with growth, really, but it is interesting because it sort of says what he was doing was interrogating our understanding of science. And they got to this critical point in the discussion where they were talking about quantum physics, and they said, and one of them said, the problem with quantum physics is that theories are supposed to do 2 things. They're supposed to have very good predictive power on the one hand, and they're supposed to be able to embed meaning and understanding into your view of the world on the other hand. And quantum mechanics has this curious quality that it's very, very good at predictive power. It's brilliant as a predictive theory. It gave us electronics, semiconductor electronics, and all sorts of other things. And it's absolutely crap at understanding the world. And it's given us no kind of sense of that at all. And so I wonder if you could speculate a little bit on the set, because I happen to think that understanding is what drove me to be a quantum physicist, it's what drove me to be an economist, it's what drove me to write Prosperity Without Growth, it's what drove me to be fascinated by the work of the Club of Rome, is this sense actually that one of the human instincts is an instinct for meaning and understanding. And I wonder if, you know, what happened in the old Enlightenment was that we somehow sacrificed meaning and understanding for predictive power. And maybe what we have to do a little bit is to roll back on all those graphs that trend endlessly upwards and say, actually, you know, progress, ingenuity, creativity is actually something much more cloudy, less directional, and would give us a better sense of our place and the meaning of our lives in the world. And I mean, that's very philosophical, isn't it? It's nothing to do with chocolate cake. Only a little bit to do with your book, but it's a little bit of a challenge and something of a provocation, hopefully, for a discussion.
Thank you, Tim. Before we pass the word back to Anders and Ernst, actually, I realized I completely lost control of the time. This is such a great conversation. Just the first result from the poll. So the question was, what is the greatest threat that we're facing today? 68% saying it's human-induced climate change, so it's really relevant to what we're talking about now. 40% said it's biodiversity loss. There's food and water scarcity, 34%. Population growth, 32%. Oh, you can see it, right? Yeah. Sorry. Populist movement, and 4% on artificial intelligence. And something actually quite, you know, artificial intelligence gives us a lot of analytics and predictive power, but it doesn't give us understanding and meaning. So, and I actually thought that it was really interesting that in the session, you know, what we've talked about the value and the crisis in philosophy. I mean, whatever we're talking about, it's moving to a more philosophical and value-based debate. Just wanted to hear your views on that, and I would quickly open for a Q&A. Otherwise, we will miss the opportunity for the alcohol.
Well, thank you for those 2 comments. Much appreciated. Let me start with one thing you said. A lot of people are fuller than others. And I really agree with that. And I think we have a reference made to another book by Piketty that came out a few weeks before the Paris conference on climate in 2015, where he had looked at not only per capita emissions per country, but per income strata. And they had done a specific study onto the US and came to the conclusion that the 1% most wealthy Americans, 3 million people, they had on average 318 tons of per capita of CO2 emissions per year, 318 tons. If we are going to make the 2-degree target, we have all to be below 2 tons, maybe even lower. So you can see. And we quoted that simply because we really realized that we have a serious problem where a very limited number of people are over-consuming in a way that is absolutely obscene on the one hand. And how are we going to motivate ordinary people whose carbon footprint may be 3 or 4 or 5 tons to lower as long as this goes on? So I really agree, and we have not really given any solution to this. Taxation is probably one tool, but you know, some people don't care if they pay high taxes because they have enough money, so they will pay it anyhow. So that is a point well taken, and I agree with you that we could have written about that in one context and not in separate context. Secondly, when it comes to what Tim brought up, our relationship to limits today. I think I've been a bit influenced by Kate Raworth. So I'm a bit agnostic about every time I give a lecture talking about precise limits. I talk about the planetary boundaries, I talk about biodiversity, I talk about the balanced climate, etc. And those are dimensions that cannot be compromised, because if we do that, we are toast. But I also believe that if we could have agreement on other measures of progress, which are not quantitative but rather qualitative, we would start moving in the right direction. But of course, ultimately, and we may already have crossed that line, that there is of course a very precise limit in many areas of the economy when it comes to extraction. Absolutely. But I've also found in debates that when you start talking about limits in sort of general terms, people don't really resonate, because they think about their own activities, their own companies, that some companies who are socially very positive or ecologically positive should grow like hell, etc. So it's a difficult debate, but I agree with you. The limits are still there. And this book is not an attempt to weaken the message of 1972, rather the opposite.
Ernst, before you say
your comment, I just want to launch the second poll, because I'm complete, which is, the question is, which presents the greatest opportunity for setting us back on the right track? So we did talk about what are the challenges and then what are the solutions. So that please vote, and then we can put the results back, please.
Thank you. Tim, this was great. Let me start with the question of the nature of the new Enlightenment. The old Enlightenment was great in developing scientific method and proofs which you could no longer deny, which was fantastic. But it was thinned down into what in the English language you call analytical philosophy, which essentially means anatomy. In the book we have a picture of a dead rat. Anatomy. What does analytical philosophy tell you about the biotopes in which rats play an important role? What does analytical philosophy tell you about systems? What does it tell about the future? And if we want to deal with the challenges of today, we better also look at systems and future. So the old analytical kind of approach was good for its specific topics, but completely insufficient for the challenges of the day. And there, an appreciation of balance, including of anatomy in medicine and therapy in medicine, which is two different animals, but both are needed. You know, so balance is, in a sense, common sense. Not much more than that. But for the dogmatists of analytical philosophy, it's a revolution. And then we have a discussion today, chiefly in America, heralded mainly by Steven Pinker, Enlightenment now. But what does he want? Essentially back to the old Enlightenment. There is a wonderful review in The Guardian saying Steven Pinker doesn't need any philosopher after Immanuel Kant. And that is not exactly a praise. Okay.
Well, thank you. So before, well, people are still voting. I think we're going to open now for Q&A. Before you raise your hand and ask questions, please tell us your name and your affiliation. Can we turn on the light, or just so that I can see? The gentleman, yeah.
Thank you very much. Hello, my name's David Nash. Can you hear me? I guess most of us a few years ago saw that article in The Guardian, which showed that all the elements of economic growth are actually on track. All the predicted elements are on track. And you know, that didn't even appear on any news program, that information. And what I want to say to Ernst and Anders is, and I'm going to read the book and I enjoy listening to you, it doesn't work. Lectures, talks don't work. And you say you're revising or you're reforming the Club of Rome, you need to think a completely different approach, because I don't need to tell you, this is a serious problem that's going to end in something very nasty if we don't do something. Now, what do I mean by that? What do I mean by a different approach? And I'm very reluctant to say this because this doesn't normally work with human beings. We've got to scare people. We've got to elegantly scare people. You will not scare people if you stand up and talk. We're talking about young people who the politicians listen to. We've got to use multimedia. social media. We've got to use all virtual reality. We've got to use all devices to do one simple thing: show them what the future looks like if we don't get this right. And I really believe that you're armed with so much information, and essentially no one's going to disagree with you, even Pinker, who I know well. So he's not going to disagree with you. But what you've got to do is get people off their lazy backsides and say, hey, that's only going to happen in my lifetime. And if you're older like me, at least in my children's lifetime. So it's that which we've got. I think you've got to have a different approach to everything you do.
That was a different approach. Actually, we have a couple of hands. I would also add one of the questions here so that we have two questions, and so we're making it, because I realize that I'm running out of time. I'm stopping you between, anyway, drinks and this very interesting conversation. Actually, before we were having this conversation about technology, disruptive technology, and there's a question here from a participant that's doing online. How would digitalization and AI affect the human rights and freedoms? And are there any dangers on digital totalitarianism? And so, I mean, we have to scare people. We need to use the new medias and new technologies, but what are the limits to that?
Okay, shall we take a few more?
We can take a few more. Oh, God. So...
my name's Colin Hines. I've written a book called Progressive Protectionism, because I think the nation state taking back control
sorry.
is... Oh, sorry. Do you have to have that again? Okay. My name's Colin Hines. I've written a book called Progressive Protectionism, because I think the nation state will gradually take back control, and you won't see such a massive flow of goods, services, money, people, etc. But I'd like to introduce a bit of vulgar sort of political imperative here, because it strikes me that the populists have got hold of very sensibly of the idea that most people feel increasingly economically and socially insecure, and they want an answer to that. And the answer to that isn't open borders. I would say it's more constraining of borders. The other thing they've got hold of is that, and my question was whether you cover this in the book, is that it isn't just a question of global population growth, it's a question of global population movement, i.e. immigration. Most of the population growth in the over-consuming north is a result of migration in terms of population growth. And so migration and providing economic security is something that the populists have got hold of, but it isn't something that the environmentalists have got hold of at all, I fear. And if we don't begin to put our arguments within the context of tackling economic insecurity and looking at migration as well as population, then I think we're leaving it to Mr. Trump and Le Pen and the Hungarians and everything else. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take a couple more questions, but please be brief so that we can, and then I'll, yes, and then I think there was a lady.
Walt Patterson from Chatham House. I have felt for many years that what we actually need most is a new story about human life on Earth. We need a different narrative that will address not only the elite and the rich, but also the person in the street in a comprehensible and attractive form. And we have all the elements of that story. But I am looking forward to reading your book because I think it may be a contribution to this story. And I would invite you to think in terms of storytelling when you are trying to make policy, because that is the most effective way to get that across to all the population that we are part of.
I'll pass back to the authors and panelists, and then we'll open another session later.
Who wants to take it? Let me briefly start. I don't see the Club of Rome's role in scaring people. I see the role rather in presenting facts in an original way and let others conclude, oh, this is really scaring, and then illustrate that. On artificial intelligence dangers, in Cambridge, England, we have the Center for the Study of Existential Risks. Who asked the question? Who was it?
It was someone who came online.
Oh, yeah, okay. One of the existential risks that could terminate the existence of humanity is artificial intelligence. Not now, not 5 years from now, not 10 years from now, but maybe 20 years from now. When artificial intelligence gets to the level of self-consciousness and the unavoidable need for becoming selfish and recognizing the only danger for them is humanity. And they have their links into weapons arsenals and many other things. So,
That is your artificial intelligence.
okay.
It was not planned.
I'm not blaming anybody.
It's already upon us.
I'm not blaming anybody for being in favor of digitization and artificial intelligence now. But now is the time to reflect on the long term, which hardly anybody does. And finally, a new narrative is a great thing. I believe, again, it is not necessarily the role of that book, but people reading the book, poets or journalists. Some of the people here in this room can easily, with their intellectual force, say, ah, now we need a new narrative.
Catherine?
I'm going to be quick because
Yeah,
I'm very keen that we hear some women's voices in the Q&A as well. But in a way, I think David and Wolf's questions were quite related. And I agree with David, your use of the term show people, because while it's very easy for those of us who read certain articles and certain news outlets and so on, to probably wrap our head around the magnitude and complexity of the challenges, I'm not convinced that's widespread I don't want to use the word understanding, but I guess awareness. And I think just sharing the extent of what's bearing down upon not just people in the future, but bearing down on human beings now all over the world. I mean, I get very frustrated when people have this theory of let's wait for the crisis, let's be ready, because it ignores the fact that so many people are already facing an extraordinary crisis, no matter where they're living, even here. So I really agree that there is a role to basically get the message out, and that's where Wolf's point around the storytelling and the narratives comes in. And if I can be so crass as to plug this tiny new organisation that I've just joined. I spent 8 years at Oxfam, and if I had Oxfam on the slide at the front, you probably would have all known what that was. But instead it says the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and that's a tiny new organisation, but its crazy ambition is to galvanise a movement around and support and amplify and connect all the extraordinary work that is already happening. We know what it's like, and there are so many good examples in the book. We know what a better economy looks like. But currently the disparate nature of that amazing progress into that sort of gap between them, business as usual just carries on. And so there is a job to connect and link it all up. And one of the key early projects of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is to work on narratives, I'd say with a plural. So we can't have one sort of grand narrative. So anyone who wants to help be part of that. And just to attend to Colin's question, I don't have all the answers. I think Tim might have a much more sort of sophisticated answer than me, but I want to share with you my favourite sentence in the Come On book, just because it's brilliant, and it'll give you a sense of the sort of the way the two have written this. It says, "To integrate the global omelette, you must disintegrate the national eggs." I love that, and I think we have the risk of going into national bunkers. As someone who spent 8 years working at an organisation that did try to take global perspective, when we're talking about the fact that it's the economic models and the consumption in the rich global north, for want of a better term, that is chewing up the ecological room for the rest of us, it's a very scary scenario, retreating. And so we've got to break those national eggs very quickly if we're going to have any chance at global justice.
Another quote in the book is that we believe very strongly that short-term profit maximization in each and every company in the world is not compatible with a sustainable planet. And I think that the tension between the short term and the long term is a fundamental issue, and why it is so difficult to move forward, because there are so many short-term interests, including stranded assets, that come in the way and which paralyzes politicians. And by the way, they are also so dependent on the short term, because in America they have elections every second year, and here every fourth or fifth year. And I'm not so sure that scaring people. There are quite a lot of psychologists who have written about this, and saying at least to me, that if you are too much of an alarmist, people close their ears. And they don't want to listen. So you must give them some kind of hope. But maybe, I agree, the message, the narrative has to be a better one. That's obviously. Yeah, sorry, Tim, I jumped before you.
No, we'll take some more questions. I mean, I would just say there was a discussion before about, we have to think about the impacts, the social impacts on people of the changes that we are asking them to make. We've never done that. We never did that in the coal fields of the north. We never did it in the industrial structure of the Rhine. We didn't do it in the Dust Belt of North America. And the upshot of that is people who really did get left behind, and the social consequences of them being left behind are real. We're looking at them in Brexit. We're looking at them in Trump's America. And Colin has a point that I think we should not entirely ride roughshod over, which is that actually people don't live in a global omelette. They live in local lives with jobs that either are there or aren't there, with prospects that either are there or aren't there, with nutrition that either is there or isn't there. And unless we're paying attention to that, we can scare them all we like and tell them lots of lovely news stories, but we're not. We've lost something along the way. It's a little bit like the point of the Enlightenment. We gained, lots of predictive power, but no sense of our place in the world. And if we want a different Enlightenment, that's where we've got to start.
So I'm going to pick a lady. We have two ladies, so we have one here and one there.
Thank you so much. I'm Natasha Brzezinski from Capital Group. A couple of weeks ago, we had Yossi Effie here, presenting also on sustainability research. He's an MIT professor. And one of the things he highlights is the conundrum of development versus sustainability, because China, frankly, did manage to bring 700 million people out of poverty. And across emerging markets, you see a middle class rising from poverty based on industrialization and trade. So how do you combine the imperatives of this more sustainable vision of the world with the fact that there are about 2.5 billion people still trying to be a little wealthier, a bit better off, and they're catching up through a fairly resource-intensive process?
There was that lady.
I'm Daphne Davis. I'm a freelance journalist. I think the message from the book is very good. Yesterday, I went to the annual general meeting of Tridos, which is ethnic banking. Last year, I went to a meeting organized by a group called Promoting Economic Pluralism. It's the same, presenting the same problems, the same answers. Is there any way that these different organizations are going to link up in some way? Because, I can go to more and more meetings with the same message. How can we do something in order to create an alliance to do something about these problems?
have the gentleman in front.
Hello, my name is Engineer Yaro. Well, my question is based on long-term and short-term. What I know scientifically, for example, London is dropping thousands of cars a year. So any car uses what they call lead-acid battery. That will be dumped in the field and goes with the water, and then uptake of mineral by the plant, and we are eating the plant. So that is disaster. Another thing, all the developed country, they are dumping chemical waste in East Africa, where they are using fishes and eats. And then the local people, they don't understand what meaning toxic. So what I say, maybe I don't understand exactly what do you mean, the balance between human and nature. If we look at China, we can see the middle classes, millions of, they are using a car. The car uses lead acid battery and acid sulfuric acid. I don't know which way you are thinking about the balance. I don't think balance is coming out. So human being, unless if you transfer this technology to the third world country, that will be appreciated. Otherwise, our future is very dark. Thank you.
I will take a question online, and it's linked to the balance question, which is it's linked to food. So it seems like we're on the food theme here. There was a cake, there was an omelette. And so what is the role and significance of factory farming, and how important it is to reduce animal-based protein in our global diet? So we have 4 questions. I'll put it back to the panel. Oh, and before that, what was the result of the polling? Before I forget, the second question. So just to add a little bit. So the question was, which presents the greatest opportunity for setting us back on the right track? So the results, it's more spread out this time. So you can see there. So rethinking the economics, changing mindset. So it's linked to what we were talking about, technological innovation, education, global governance, and changing lifestyle. So with that just adds a different layer to some of the questions that audience posed us. Who would like to take this one?
I'd like to talk about the factory farming. In the book, we have a picture of a stable for pigs. Terrible. And the narrative around it is the following. We have calculations about the body weights worldwide of 3 categories of vertebrates. One is we, humans. One is the animals, chiefly factory animals, you know?
Livestock and pets.
Livestock and pets, good. And the third is the wild animals. What's the distribution in the world? The answer is 30% is we, our body weights. 7.6 billion people, you know, average 60 or 80, I don't know what, kilograms. 67% is the animals that we eat, essentially. And 3% is left for wild animals. This is the Anthropocene, meaning Homo sapiens, or stupid, whatever, is ruining the world. Yeah. And factory farming is one of the most powerful factors in that.
Yeah. You asked about how can we accommodate another 2 to 3 billion people moving from poverty levels to middle income or whatever. I mean, we have no choice. These people have a right to development. And if you start looking into different sectors of the economy, I think we have sufficient hope today, or optimism, that in many areas we can lower the footprint significantly by a combination of clean energy, energy efficiency, circular economy, reuse, recycling, refabrication, or whatever, regenerative agriculture, regenerative economy, I would say. So trying to copy nature as much as possible, also in the technosphere. So I'm absolutely positive that we can do it, but I think at the same time, some of us in the rich countries who consume far too much, we have to tighten the belt. And how that redistribution is going to take place, whether it's through some spiritual revolution or policy measures or a combination, I don't know. Maybe it's part of a new Enlightenment. But I think what Catherine and Tim brought to the fore, namely what is really the meaning of life? What is a good life? That is a debate that is long overdue. And I'm not saying that young people in general entertain very different ambitions and demands and lifestyles, but I think I see among a lot of young people a realization that this material consumption lifestyle is not the main objective in life. I think I see that.
I'd like to add one policy question. We have a sub-chapter in the book in which essentially we say to do ecologically bad things has to become economically negative. Otherwise, we dump the dirt onto Africa, and I mean what the gentleman has been saying, it is simply cheap, and therefore we do it. And what is good for our grandchildren's generation should become profitable. So changing the frame in a sense that the good things get profitable and the bad things not is something policy can make. And I mean, this was my motive for getting into Parliament. And we did certain steps, like the feed-in tariffs law, which triggered off the energy revolution, and the ecological tax reform in Germany, which actually created jobs in Germany by the thousands, and the country got richer. So this is what we can do, but that means don't spit on politicians, help them do the right things.
You can spit on some of the bad ones.
Okay.
Well, going to name them?
No, we are on record, so I'm not sure.
I thought this was Chatham House.
Yes, we're on record today. I know we're coming to the hours, but I actually would like to have another, if people are happy, to have another round of Q&As, and then when the panelists answer, they can also share with us their parting thoughts. Okay, so we have the gentleman.
Thanks very much. Chris Rapley from University College London. You propose a new Enlightenment as one of the ways forward, but 50 years on, rational thinking has failed. You've given people the evidence, you've given them the arguments, it hasn't worked. So don't we actually need a new populism? We see that populism, offering people simplistic answers in a complex world that ride with their emotions, is a very powerful way of making people act differently. But the new populism would need to cohere, because this is the greatest collective action in history, not divide, which is the way populism works at present. So is there a populism that could cohere? And if there were, would it be ethical to use it?
We have the lady here in front. We need it.
My name is Christina Coward. I'm from the Chatham House member. I would like to ask a question regarding the poll, actually, because I'm quite surprised that with the answers, nobody really gave much importance to education. I think the number one of this is education. Now, how do I say that? I believe that unfortunately, in most economies in the world, access to education is very limited. However, we now are working with the media and the social media, that is very important to pass the message across to people in different countries and younger people of the importance of exactly what you're trying to say here, because this is very important that the world in general and people in the world are informed in their language, in an easy language, which is what this gentleman was talking about, narrative. Narrative has to be in a very, very simple language, which I believe that the social media, which even though it's part of the artificial intelligence, we need to use social media and globalization towards this common aim, which is to protect our planet, because we're all sharing the same planet. And I believe that that's just a final thought. It's not really for you to answer. If you want, you can comment on it. But it's regarding the trends that are coming across since the programs on television and also social media and also reporters with the Sky News and everything, talking about the importance of clean oceans. Look how much this has changed since that program was on TV. So other things have to be put across to people through the television, through concerts, pop concerts, fashion shows, the Victoria and Albert now is doing something about the recycled fabrics. All that is extremely important to pass across, but it's through education, because most people, they don't have that access unless they have access to information, and that's it.
Okay, 2 more questions. I have a gentleman there who, and then we'll close for, that gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. Greg Neal, the editor-in-chief of Resurgence and Ecologist magazine and the Resurgence Trust, and as an organisation which has just celebrated our 50th anniversary, Resurgence magazine, may I congratulate the Club of Rome. But it's an awful anniversary, 50 years, in our case 52, and the messages get more and more dire. There may be 1 or 2 indices which are looking better than they were 50 years ago, but there really aren't very many. So just before artificial intelligence intervenes, and before we all go off for a drink, rather than to drown our sorrows, can I have quickly from each member of the panel a good reason, a toast if you like, as for why we should still have some degree of hope? Thank you very much.
That's a good one.
Duke Oputa, Chatham House member. My question is a follow-up to what the lady was talking about in terms of development. Most of the population growth that we anticipate in the next century is going to happen in the developing economy. Is there a case for using underdevelopment as, if you like, a cue for showcasing what is possible in terms of a greener prosperity? That is to say that it is a bit more difficult to try and change what is already in place in the developed world, but in developing economies where it is possible to bring in new development models, it is possible for the universal, the world to come together to put an investment together that can demonstrate that prosperity is possible without the carbon footprint.
Thank you. So, yes.
Good question for him.
Yeah, but it's the same question really in a way. I absolutely fundamentally believe that there is a concept of a story, if you like, in Walt's words, that offers profound hope. And I think in a way it's right to go back to the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment was a kind of process of taking enchantment out of the world at one level. It didn't intend to do that necessarily. It intended to use a certain part of the human brain and the human ingenuity, in Ronald Reagan's terms, to understand better, to throw light on the unknown, to create opportunities for more people. And even capitalism, in all its glory and all its horrors, has, in some sense, at its roots, that same project to bring to people a better kind of life. And I think that disenchantment that accidentally crept in through the Enlightenment is fundamentally responsible for, not necessarily for the environmental damage that's been caused, not necessarily for the overindulgence of one section of the population rather than another, but actually for a kind of absence of a sense of meaning, of a story about ourselves as part of a world in which actually we could live with a lot less than we have and be stronger and fuller and healthier and happier and with stronger social relationships, not fighting so much all the time, not constantly struggling after status, actually being in some sense both interior as beings in a complex world and understanding what it means to be in that inside, but also reaching out to those around us in a different kind of way. And to me, you know, actually the conversation that I started with around the kids and the chocolate cake, you know, when we are kids, we don't have those controls, we don't have those visions, we don't have that sense of the learning of the world. And in a way, what we've kind of have to do is to accept that the model of an economy in which we expose as many kids as possible to as many chocolate cakes as possible in order to provoke their innate appetites for more and for a better life is actually a defunct economy. It's the system of the economy that has drawn us out of track with this rationalistic perspective of the Enlightenment, and I think we got lost in that process. And the story that I really hope that we can reclaim through that, and the Enlightenment that I hope we can reclaim through that, is a calmer, emptier, fuller, more beautiful, more connected place in which actually we can be more human than we have been, and we can also be more in touch with the nature that supports and sustains us. That, to me, is a hugely positive story.
Thank you. Catherine? Let's just go.
I love that idea of being more human, because it does take us straight back to those real innate fundamental human needs. And that's where, to answer Greg's call for a toast, I think that's where the hope and the optimism does come from, that human beings really are the same, and they're just sort of battered and pushed and cajoled and dictated to act and behave in ways, and whether they're politicians or whether they're consumers or whether they're people working in certain businesses, who I don't believe there are many, you know, evil people really in business. I think there are just, you know, governance systems that push good people into doing bad stuff. And I think if we do have a mantra of, you know, being more human, then we will start to enable people to act in the ways that, you know, the future depends upon. And I wanted to pick up with Daphne's question because you basically asked for the sort of organisation I've been working for the last 14 days, and the idea that there are a lot of amazing groups and initiatives working on the problems, identifying similar sort of problems, coming up with very linked and related solutions. And yet the problem is they're still disparate and not working together enough. So that's a challenge that the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is picking up. And I invite everyone to try and be part of that. And Chris's question, are you working on that? Sort of making complex questions, not maybe populism in the toxic sense, but accessible and popular. And I mean, we've seen it done with something as hairy and as tricky as the tax evasion and avoidance. We had UK Uncut, you know, setting up a childcare centre in Boots or a library in Starbucks. So I'm not sure it's necessarily slipping into this sort of toxic notion of populism, but I don't think we should shy away from the complex nature. I think the trick is to portray them in ways that are not drowning people and obscuring them with complexity, but in ways that people understand. I'd love to chat more if this is stuff you're working on.
Thank you. Anders?
There was a question about, is it possible to create well-being in those parts of the world where there is very little development still? Of course it is. We have technologies today, we know how to organize things today that we didn't know or didn't have 25, 50 years ago or 100 years ago when industrialization took on in this part of the world. But there is a tendency to repeat more or less the same pathway. And I'm on the board of Swedish International Development Authority, SIDA. We have quite a significant budget. And I'm afraid the only area where I can see that SIDA is really pushing good technologies is when it comes to renewable energy. In all the other fields, it's very much business as usual. So there has to be some kind of a revolution. But I agree with you that should be the focus. Well-being, but partly in a different way. Secondly, I do think one of the problems we face and which we indicate in the book is this silo mentality and that institutions are not fit for purpose. We have both been members of parliaments. I in the European Parliament and Ernst in the Deutsche Bundestag. And you know, the fight and tensions between committees and ministries, by the way, is a major problem. And most of the issues we are discussing cannot be solved within one sector or one discipline. They require a lot of cooperation. So the institutions we have to be rethought. Whether we should look for populism to solve this, I don't know. I mean, populism is such a toxic word right now. What I believe we need are leaders who are speaking the truth and who don't divide, but rather bring us together. And that's, to me, the biggest problem with a man like Trump, that he divides society and people all the time. It's we or them, and everybody that doesn't support me is my enemy, etc. You cannot build a society that way. And we see tendencies in Europe also of this to happen. And it's very, very scary. And we should learn a bit by history. So leadership is very, very important. I was in a seminar a couple of weeks ago talking about education, where I understood that the quality of the individual teacher is by far much more important than the curricula in itself. When you have a good teacher providing leadership and a good pedagogue, then miracles happen. So I think leadership is very much in short supply. And finally, since I've been in party politics in and out of my life, I must say that I'm very, very concerned about the state of art when it comes to party political systems in this part of the world. There is something wrong with the way we recruit politicians. There is something wrong in the way they work. And they also come from backgrounds that are not sufficiently broad. I remember we did a poll in the European Parliament in 2007 when we were moving into the climate discussion. There were 5 members out of 761 who had a scientific background. Meaning that when the climate experts comes to the committee meeting, there is a quite good discussion as long as the expert is still there. When the expert leaves the room, there's nobody really to hold hands, so to say, and bring the message forward. Well, I was there, so I did it. But, but I mean, this is a fundamental issue. And so many of the problems we are discussing require some kind of scientific understanding. Yeah. Okay, I stop there. Sorry.
I'd like to give 3 replies. First, education. It's extremely important. We have 2 major chapters in the book. In Germany, they created so-called Club of Rome schools, in which the integration of knowledge is more important than excellent in separated disciplines. On the extremely difficult question by the gentleman about cohesion populism, I'd like to say that could be a doable program for, in particular, earlier socialist parties, which are in a state of disarray worldwide. And there used to be representatives of the poorer. So those people who are now falling to populism. But this is a constructive task. It's not just imagination. And one of the important parts of that construction should be creating, designing appropriate balances between speed and stability. I happen to have worked for or in biological cybernetics, from which I know that systems that are governed by speed are self-destroying. They can't survive. You need a strong degree of stability. And this is what people going for populist parties today are missing. In today's capitalism, which has such a huge premium on speed, and completely ignoring the need for stability. And this is part, of course, of the agenda of a new economy. And finally, on the question of optimism, or however you call it, you know, let me give you 3 reasons that for hope. One is pollution control. When I was at school or in university, the air and water in Germany was absolutely disgusting and terrible. And today it's essentially clean. It did not happen without a strong popular movement that was there. It is easier to get a popular movement for short-term damages than for long-term damages. But education can help. Then population. In our book we have a striking picture showing that those parts of the world which managed to stabilize their population were the economic winners. This is a very important knowledge. Many people, in particular in some developing countries, Islamic countries and very Christian countries, ignore that. And thirdly, on the international scale, it is very important to realize what a blessing the European Union is. It is essentially a program for nation states to surrender sovereignty rights to a larger entity and benefiting from it. I mean, here sits Nigel Haig, who has been studying the benefits for Britain, for Italy and other European countries of European environmental policy. So, those are 3 sketchy elements that give me sufficient hope.
Well, well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Tim, Catherine, Anders, and Ernst. We have now, I completely busted we're more than almost half an hour late. There's drinks upstairs. Please follow the staff. Thank you very much. Thank you.